Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the SSP Challenge, How to Build a Plan That Will Pass an Assessment. I am joined today in this very important conversation with my colleague Noel Vestal and some esteemed colleagues at Redspin, Thomas Graham and Robert Teague. Let me just introduce them quickly, and then we will get on with the webinar. Dr. Thomas Graham serves as a CISO for Redspin, as well as Synergistic and Backbone. He is the chief architect of Redspin becoming the first authorized C3PAO. And if I didn't mention that, in addition to Redspin being a C3PAO, they are also the first company which received that honor. Standing above Robert, from my point of view, is Thomas Graham. Thomas is the Security and Assessment Consulting Manager and a certified CMMC provisional assessor and registered practitioner. He has over 30 years of experience in IT and cyber operations with the U.S. Army. And last but not least is my colleague Noel Vestal, who is the compliance manager at PreVeil, but is one of the most knowledgeable people I have met on this topic, and has over 15 years of experience managing compliance programs at the DoD. As a way to get started, perhaps let me just introduce the topic one more time. The idea is, how do you build an SSP and what is required in order to pass an assessment? We realize that many people, many listeners on today's conversation are dealing with this challenge at their own organization and are wondering how they can build the SSP, their system security plan, which is a key part of their getting on to passing NIST and eventually CMMC level 2. So why don't we just look at how we're going to manage that conversation? Let me just share today's agenda. We're going to try and break that conversation down by looking at these key areas. We're going to first talk about who is my audience for the SSP, what needs to be in my SSP, how to organize my SSP, and then key takeaways, and then some plenty of time for Q&A. So I think I've spoken enough for now, and I'm going to turn it on over to you, Robert. Robert, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks, PreVeil, for having us back again. It's always a pleasure of ours to work with you, especially on this important topic, right? We've had a lot of conversations on our personal podcasts with Redspin and in previous webinars with you guys. But I don't think anything has really gone into the depth of what we're about to do today. Now, again, we're going to try and keep this high level because an SSP is built towards every organization and every organization is different. But one of the main things, if you can go to the next slide, is in the who's my audience realm is, first of all, to understand the definition of the SSP. And this comes straight from NIST. But when you're building the SSP, you need to remember, first of all, who's going to read it, right? Who's it for? So it's for your employees, obviously, that access CUI, but it's also built for your auditors or assessors and the C3PAOs for CMMC. So you need to kind of keep in mind as you're building this and as we move through this conversation in the webinar, who's going to follow it, who's going to read it, who's going to update it. We'll cover that a little bit later, right? Because that's very important. And then, you know, where should you start? And so with that, I'll kind of pass it on to either Thomas or Noel to jump in case I missed anything.
No, that sounds pretty good, Rob. And I think, Orly, if you want to, we can go on to the next slide.
Here we go. What needs to be in the SSP? And the next slide, please. So as we work through this, we're going to talk about templates, right, that are available. I know, and some of the questions already submitted to Orly and the PreVeil team. A lot of folks are asking about where can I get reliable and free templates. One of the conversations Noel and Thomas and I have had is, well, there's reliable and then there's free. There's not both. So keep that in mind, okay? The other thing I should point out is that Noelle herself has built an SSP, which also makes her a subject matter expert, if you will, on this topic. But the template you see before you is taken directly from the NIST website, and the website you can see there that Orly has. This is the actual template that Thomas pulled down and built from. Notice it doesn't have anything in it. There's nothing preset in it. It just tells you whether you're implementing it, plan to be implemented, even though that should be changed to inherited, and not applicable, right? So after that, it just says, put in your stuff. And that's what Thomas did for Redspin. He built it from scratch. Now, as I mentioned in our conversations earlier with Noelle and Thomas, our parent company, Synergistic, has policies, procedures, everything in place for the network. So Thomas just kind of grabbed those, pulled them in, and then addressed the CUI portion into it to address each practice. Anything I'm missing, Thomas?
I think that's a really good point. Just really quick to interject. It's a really good point is that there were already pre-existing policies and procedures that you could sort of leverage. So having something, a free version, wasn't as big of a challenge. I mean, I'm sure it's still a challenge, Thomas. I don't want to take away from that, but I know how much of a challenge it was. But it's definitely a lot easier, I would imagine, when you already have a sort of a backbone that you can leverage. If you're talking about coming at it from very little or nothing, a free template, like you were saying, there's reliable and there's free. There is no information in this NIST template whatsoever other than here are the controls, and it gives a format in a Word document. I mean, it's pretty much all you're getting. So it's something to definitely consider, that there's an amount of work that's going to go into this that's pretty extensive if you try to do one of these free versions.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're right, Noelle. But one of the things I just want to touch on, which Rob mentioned, was when you're looking at this and you see what's on the screen in front of you, there is no location currently on this particular document for inheritance. And we all know that in every organization, you inherit things from, either your top level at your governance level, or you could inherit it from other vendors, other services. And so being able to correctly identify that when you're going through your assessment is going to make things a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. The main thing here is, and going back to some of the questions that were submitted, is, free and reliable. So again, there are plenty of examples of SSPs. You can Google it. There's plenty of stuff out there. Is anything going to be tailored to your organization? No, because every organization is different. So are you going to see some wording that's filled in? Yeah, we're going to provide you some examples here, but will that be a cookie cutter fit to your company? No. So at some point, you still need to go in and tweak this to your organization. Now, as far as free, I kind of liken it, and you get what you pay for, right? So most organizations charge a fee because certified officials have put this together, and it's taken time and energy, and somebody's got to pay for that time and energy, obviously, right? So there has to be a recoup benefit to give them their time or pay for their time. I will tell you, PreVeil has a robust policy program. They got some excellent templates. And their pricing, as I mentioned to Noelle and Orly earlier, is probably a little bit lower than some of the other ones I've seen. But I do want to point out to our listeners that when you're seeking policy packages or templates, stick with somebody that is prevalent in the CMMC realm. And we kind of talked this earlier in our personal podcast with Redspin. If you go outside that realm, do people really understand what CMMC is? NIST 800-171, DIBCAC, DIBCAC high, do they understand that? That's a question for you to ask, right? So if you stick with organizations such as PreVeil and others that are working within this, the CMMC realm, you'll find that the policy packages and the templates are a little more reliable than others, okay? All right, so with that, I think we've beaten this slide down. So let's go on to the next one. And I'll start off with, we'll give you an example here of an access control. Now, this is the practice 3.1.1. It's a level 1 practice, comes straight out of NIST 800-171, and it is the first CMMC practice in access control. So limit system access to authorized users. So again, we're going to approach this in this conversation as Thomas and I are provisional assessors. So we're going to tell you kind of what we look for. First of all, this is just a paragraph out of an SSP, right? And in our phase 1 of the assessment process, we're going to review all your objective evidence, and one of them is the SSP. So we're going to look for keywords as we're reviewing your documentation. As you can see here, is limited when you talk about access to the secure enclave. Pick whatever system it is, whether it's Azure, on-prem, whatever the case may be, is limited. So that's the first word I'm going to catch as I'm reading this as an assessor. Okay, they're limiting it. That's awesome. I'm going to keep going through. Access to the enclave is denied by default. Ding. Okay, so now that's what I want to see in a test. So you told me it's limited. Now I want to see that you've got it denied by default, right? Thomas, am I missing anything?
No, you're hitting on the key elements, but the biggest thing when you're looking through whatever template you use, or if you create it yourself, is to understand that those key terms that when you're going through an assessment that the assessors are going to look at. So if I see something, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this later, when I see a statement that says denied by default, as an assessor, that tells me I am looking for very specific items. And if you don't have that in your objective evidence, or have the ability to communicate that in your SSP, you're going to be doing quite a lot of explaining when you're going through the formal assessment. Limitations, I mean, everybody should be, aware of that. You don't want everybody in your organization having access to CUI, but when you say it's limited, okay, now how is it limited? What do I need to show? Do I need to have all of these items in the SSP, or can I point to something else? And that's where, understanding what an SSP is supposed to be, kind of helps us out with. And I think if you go to the next slide, Orly.
Can I just point out one thing, Thomas? Just to clarify, these examples that we're showing here, for this text, did this come from a cleaned up version of your own SSP that you submitted when you underwent a C3PAO audit? So I think that's an important thing to share with the audience, right? This isn't just a random something gotten off the internet. This is sample language that C3P that you guys at Redspin used while you were, undergoing your own audit. So it kind of gives a little bit of a stronger sense of what the people are going to be looking for who are undergoing an audit. And you guys obviously passed. All right, so let me shut up and move to the next slide.
All right, so, and just carrying on from what we were talking about previously, it's limitations. How do you identify that you're limiting access to a system? And this is, full disclosure, this is just sample. This isn't anything indicative of what we submitted, but it has the elements of what would be required. You would need to want to capture somebody's name, what type of device they're accessing it from, what's your operational software baselines that you're allowing access. Does that potential person, and if they're in the CUI SSP, they're going to have, it's going to be presumed that they have access to CUI, but if you're pointing to a larger access matrix, for instance, that's maintained by your organization, you may have, some type of column that readily identifies which users have access to CUI and which one doesn't. But being able to not only quickly show this, communicate it in the SSP, either, as I said, if you wanted to have an access matrix in your SSP, more power to you. But when you're going through your own human resources and your own hiring and whatever other practices you do, now you're going to be required to update in more locations than just one if you're inheriting it from your organizational matrix. Rob, Orly, Noel, do you have anything else to add?
I think that really hit the nail on the head that, when you were talking about putting it actually in the SSP, you could put this information directly in the SSP, absolutely. But like you said, you're going to have to update this every time somebody gets hired, every time somebody leaves, every time somebody transfers, every time somebody gets a new computer. How many times does that happen? I mean, these are the kind of things you have to think about. So having this as an example, since I know you guys, were more Microsoft focused. So, maybe this would be a SharePoint list, and only certain people have access to it. And you can update that information as needed. You need to put it in some place that's a little bit easier to update, because any updates you make to the SSP, you should be probably, mentioning those updates, making sure that it gets approved again, signed off by any approval authority. There's so many different pieces and parts and moving parts with that you'd have to do. It makes way more sense to have it referenced out to someplace that's easier and more dynamic.
Yeah, and also, this document that you're looking at should involve everybody that's within scope. So keep that in mind. So if Redspin, we have our, our enclave is in the cloud. It's totally separate from our parent company, Synergistic. So if I'm building this matrix, I'm only going to put those folks that have access to that cloud environment, and that's it. Nobody else, because they're not in the scope. However, if this is an on-prem, an organization that has on-prem servers in the data center, etc., then the whole organization is in scope, more than likely. And if that's the case, you do need to list it as you see it here. This person has access, this person does not, etc.
And one last point before we move on, guys. 90% of the battle with any type of assessment like this is understanding the language that they're wanting to use. So, we're talking system security plans, SSPs. Understand in this context what it's referring to in system is that CUI enclave, that CUI area, depending upon how you've scoped your environment. That's what the SSP should really cover, because what it's concerning is the access to CUI. If you have CUI on just one server, okay, that's the target of your SSP. If you have it in a virtual enclave, cloud-based, if you will, that's the target of your SSP. It depends upon that scoping, because when you're looking at the system, and we kind of glossed over some of the aspects of it, but it could also talk to processes. It also talks to other systems having access to that enclave. So when you're looking at it, think of everything that would touch that: vulnerability scanning, antivirus, SIEM or SIM, however you want to pronounce it. What is touching it? Does it have access to CUI? These are things that you have to be asking yourselves. And to answer the question, yes, those would need to be something that is tracked on some type of access matrix, whether it be through firewalls or some other mechanism.
Yeah, and that
All
would
right.
be your
Why don't
test.
we move on to the next
Yeah.
one? We do have a number of them to get through.
So the next slide, right? And the other thing that we highlighted is the deny all by default, right? So this, I think many of you know what, the console looks like, right? This is just an example of things that we would be looking for, right? What port number, the destination, and the action. Is it indeed deny all, right? So that would be the test portion of the first practice that we just looked at. So from start to finish, we reviewed the SSP. More than likely, it kicked us out to an access control policy, which we're going to review. But the big takeaway was you told me that you control access to it, you limit it, and then you have your default settings as deny all, right, by default. So looking at the matrix that we just reviewed, yeah, I see you're limiting things. So what am I going to ask for? I probably want to see one of those the device, or as Thomas mentioned, the firewall that shows where they can get them in, or they have access, whatever the case may be, something that shows it is limiting them. And then this on the console, right? This would be the other test piece. Once we're done and we've looked at that, you have now basically told us what you're doing. You've shown us what you're doing, and the test tells us that you are actually doing what you just told us you're doing. Make sense?
No,
All right, why don't we hit the next one here?
Yeah, next one, and then I'll be quiet. Let Thomas take this one.
All right, well, I should take this one away.
Sure. So when you're talking CMMC, one of the biggest things that trips folks up is, well, it's an IT function. It's a security function. And you're right, it is. But it's not just those individuals within your organization. It also encompasses marketing, and it encompasses HR, which I alluded to earlier. And one of the biggest areas of that evidence is in awareness and training, because I can almost guarantee you your HR folks are the gatekeepers to your recruiting in your organization. So when you're going through and you're constructing your SSP, when you're getting everything together for an assessment, your HR folks need to be a part of that. Well, why do they need to be a part of it? Because not only are they involved with recruiting, but more than likely they are the ones that are responsible for tracking and promoting training within your organization. How often is it being conducted? Is it, what kind of standards? Is it just security standards? Is it privacy standards? Is it operational standards? They're going to be the ones that the assessors are going to want to talk to, because without having that understanding in how it relates to CUI, because yes, there is CUI specific training. It's available on the CMMC's website. That's, this is going to be something that the assessors are going to have issues with. And Noelle, Rob, anything to add to that?
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head, that there are so many different people that assessors are going to want to talk to that are not specifically IT and security. And HR is such a perfect one, because like we were just talking about, if you have people who are getting hired and fired and, they have different computers that are assigned to them and everything else, there's going to be HR functions that go along with that as well. So why wouldn't an assessor want to ask them too? And that also means that HR team also needs to have the training that, all of your security and IT have, making sure that they understand, like you were referencing to the DoD training and CMMC training regarding CUI. It's not just one part of your organization. It's really very holistic approach to this.
Oh, excellent example. If you can go to the next slide, Orly, I think that's a perfect example of what you guys just brought up. So as an assessor, if this is, organizations use, and I'm just going to throw out an example, KnowBe4. That's one of the big training, right, solutions that's out there. And there's others, but it doesn't have to be a big solution like that. You can use a simple matrix to track who is taking their security awareness training and when, right? So if I'm looking at this as an assessor, I'm looking at, okay, Alice has done security awareness training, so has Bob. Chris and Doug have done role-based training, and everybody else is on an annual basis, but Chris and Doug are on a semi-annual basis. So I'm going to ask you, how come? It's that simple. And you just make a statement. Hey, it's role-based, so they're either administrators, and because they're administrators, we require them to perform specific role-based training semi-annually, and then they do the actual security awareness training annually. It's that simple, right? Do you have that documented somewhere? Oh, yes, it's in our awareness and training policy. Well, let me see that.
Well, the part that's not so simple, Rob, and this is the part that trips people up, is when you're thinking role-based training, most folks think, okay, they're an IT analyst or they're a security engineer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What if they're the folks in your organization that handle your SIEM or your SIM? Can you properly show where you have allotted and supplied training specific to that function that gives them the ability to manage that system? Same thing with your EDR systems or your vulnerability management systems. That's where it's getting into the operational context of training that a lot of folks fall short on.
Yeah. And remember, it should be targeted too. Your executive level should have specific training for them with awareness of whaling, etc. Right. And it just goes, each particular job or role should have something designed specifically for them.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Rob, the executive level. I think that's something that people really overlook too. I think that sometimes you get to that C level and you just sort of think like, well, this is all getting handled below. It doesn't really apply to me, or I'm really busy, or I've got other things. I know that almost every company probably has this issue at one point or another, trying to get security awareness training done at that level, but it is imperative, because absolutely, if you think that an assessor is not going to want to talk to your executive management about their training, then you're thinking wrong.
Exactly. Okay, next slide. All right, so Noelle, why don't you hit this one?
Sure. Audit and accountability. So again, it's the same kind of thing we've been talking about. You want to make sure that whatever you say here is what you're actually doing and be able to actually prove that. In this case, it's a Windows virtual desktop, and it's automatically generating and maintaining audit records to track significant system events or activities. So that would be one of those key lines. Okay, well, you're telling me that you maintain these records, you track significant events and activity. I want to see where that happens. I want to see how you do that. So let's go to the next slide, Orly.
No, spot on. Boom, right there.
So this is a very high level, again, very high level generic version, but you want to make sure that you can say, okay, well, here you go. Here's our list of auditable events. These are the things that we can say. And also, aside from even this too, even before this, you want to have a list of things that you're looking out for. What is considered a security incident in your organization? And it's going to be a little different. Obviously, if you have like a whaling attempt, that's probably going to be across the board, but there might be very specific ones to each individual system that you have to list. You want to make sure that's in policy or procedure somewhere. Hey, these are the things that we're going to look for. Here's the impact of those. That all goes into risk assessment as well, which is another part, because so many of these, cross over. And then also you want to make sure that you can actually show your assessor, hey, this is where we see those audible events. This is where it's tracking. This is the dashboard, or this is the policy view, or whatever it is, so they can actually see it. And this, again, this is just a generic example, but this is some of those high level things that an assessor is going to want to look at.
Yeah,
So,
and the other thing, yeah, sorry, Noel. The other thing that's to tie into is your incident response, right? So
definitely.
You have a potential high vulnerability here. Do you have somewhere stated how long your technicians or your network engineers have to resolve that vulnerability? You should. Somewhere documented should say they have 72 hours to address all highs or criticals. So you should have that broken down somewhere. Sometimes it's in the incident response. You could have it broken out separate into a whole different other policy or procedure somewhere else. It's entirely up to you where you document it. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Next slide. And look at that. Perfect transition.
You knew it was perfect.
It's like I knew what was coming up here. Oh, I tell you, it's like I got ESPN. No, so the incident response, right? Again, you think on the surface that, oh my gosh, incident response is huge. And you're right. It is very daunting because you have to cover every aspect of incident response. One of the main things that we're gonna, as an assessor, look at here, and again, this is just a paragraph out of the SSP. Is it from ours? Yep, just one paragraph out of, I think in the incident response plan, Dr. Graham there has at least 6 paragraphs that discuss incident response. And it references out to our incident response plan, our incident response policies, our procedures, who makes up the teams, who makes up, what kind of communications we're going to use during an incident. Is that regular, we call it a PACE plan. Your primary, we're going to use, cell phones. What is the alternate communication plan? We're going to use email, right? Those kinds of things. It should all be documented out there. And those are the things we're going to kind of look at. But here, as it's captured in the SSP, and as mentioned earlier by both Noel and Thomas, you don't want to go into significant amounts of detail if you can avoid it, because that means you're going to have to, anytime there's a change, you got to come back to the SSP and change and update it. And that can be very, very daunting, right? At minimum, your SSP should be reviewed annually at minimum, right? To seek updates, make sure it's in line with the latest threats that are out there in the industry, any changes in your network. It's keeping up with the flow of CMMC and the language, right? But anything that's specific to incident response, where you should really tackle that and keep it up to date, is in the policies and the plans.
So when we went through our assessment, Rob, some of the things that I remember, and full disclosure, I did try to block out most of that experience, and I'm joking, everybody, it wasn't that bad. But when we went through it, some of the key things that they wanted to understand was, 1, do you have some type of plan in place? 2, do you have the reporting mechanisms and the proper reporting channels identified? And what I'm getting at there is that when you're dealing with CUI, there's very specific reporting requirements the DoD require if CUI is called up in an incident. So you need to not only, understand those, but they also need to be referenced in the plan. So like when I, win the lottery next week and go to Bora Bora, Rob will understand what he needs to do and what the rest of the organization needs to do to be able to account for that. So it's more than just, hey, call this person, they'll take care of it, or, we've done it, we've got it, but we're not really sure all the specific steps. You have to understand what's going on there. And one of the other key, points as far as evidentiary evidence, and I know this is a little off topic of the SSP, do you actually practice it? Do you do tabletops and real world exercises? And that's part of the objective evidence, that you're going to be required to present, during your assessment.
Yep. Right. Next slide. So again, here's an example. Ours kicks out to, the incident response plan, where it's documented in there, the different type of incidents, right? So we've got predefined incidents, how we handle those, who handles those. If it's a particular incident, who becomes the incident commander? Do we need to set up some kind of command center? I mean, there's all kinds of things you can go down as far as your incident plan, but the main thing that the assessors are going to look for is whatever you stated in the SSP, we're going to come back to your incident response plan or policy to make sure that everything's addressed and covered. Now, because of 2.0, right, the ability to have a POAM is in play. We don't yet know the policy of what all can go into that POAM because the DoD hasn't released it yet. But I can tell you, if we're going through as an assessor, your incident response plan or your processes, right, and something's missing, I'm just going to tell you, hey, you may want to have some kind of matrix that you can capture evidence with a date timestamp, right? You produce that the next day, you're good to go, right? So I don't want anybody to be completely scared of this assessment, right? But you just need to make sure everything's covered when you're talking incident response. This is a primary example. It's got the stakeholders on it, who's alerted, and that's also a key piece of the communication. Who needs to know, right? Not everybody needs to know there's some kind of incident going on, especially a data breach. You don't want everybody to know that. There's only certain people that need to know, right? So that's one of the things you should have defined. Questions, comments? All right. I think this is our last one, personnel security. One of my favorites too. Go ahead.
So we were talking personnel security, and give it a few seconds for Orla to get the slides back up. So personnel security, again, this is one of the ones that more often than not falls outside of your computer team or, your security team, whatever you want to call them, and usually resides back with your HR folks. When you're talking, and the example we're using here is screening individuals prior to authorizing them access. So in most organizations nowadays, you may do criminal checks, you may do, some kind of financial checks, employment checks, drug screenings, whatever, depending upon the type of organization you have. But some of the key things that, kind of helped us out when we went through is we already benchmarked against the OIG background check parameters. So we were able to, one, show that. But two, you're talking CUI, you're talking about a protected data class according to the DoD. So you also have to account within your personnel security that you verified that they're authorized to have access to CUI, which, means our, US citizenship. Have they been convicted of, different types of either felonies, misdemeanors, whatever. Because when you're going through, if there's any questions, then your HR person has to justify the reason why they are still being allowed access, even if they may have thrown a red flag with your own requirements. And you don't have to put every single requirement or every single thing on your SSP. Generally, with personnel security, this is already captured either in an employee handbook or some other type of HR documentation, and you can reference it out in your SSP to that other documentation So whenever it's updated, you're not updating it in multiple places anymore. Noel, Rob, anything else to add?
The only thing I would add is when you were talking, for example, if you had somebody that, you know, maybe had some sort of criminal infraction and you decided to go ahead and hire them anyway, making sure that there's something in your policy or procedures as to how a deviation like that is tracked. You know, you want to make sure to say, hey, in my policy, yeah, we can have a deviation. Here are the people who have to sign off on it. And here's where it's going to be listed. This is how we're going to, you know, this is how we're going to maintain that, you know, that kind of thing. I definitely want to make sure that people understand that if there is some kind of deviation from your standard, you need to put that in your policy, that there is an opportunity for that and how you would do it.
Yep, exactly. So as an assessor, right, I'm looking at this paragraph in your SSP. And so I'm looking at the 1, 2, and 3. You do criminal checks over the last 7 years. So I'm going to ask you in the test phase, can you give me an example of Noel's document, or pick an employee and show me the criminal check? Right? I don't need to see all the details of it. I just need to see that you've actually done it and it's maintained on file. Next thing, an employment check over the last 5 years. Is that listed for Noel as well? Right? And then OIG or drug testing. Can you show me what form you use? How do you communicate it to Noel to go out and take her drug test? Right? Where does she have to go? How are you partnered with them? And is it maintained on file for your organization? If you show me those, you just told me what you're going to do. You showed me what you're doing. It matches. Check. I move on to the next one. Okay. All right. Questions. Moving on. Next one. Here's an example. Perfect example. Right. So they've done a background check. Most of these are, you know, you'll see some government clearances, secret, top secret, SCI. Chris, for some reason, just needed a general background check, right? Diane had some issues, so we wanted to do a financial background check on her. Why is it different? Maybe Diane works in your finance department, right? So you want to do a background check financially on her. So this is the kind of stuff that we see. Notice it says cleared, no issues. They're capturing the results of those. And that on its own will suffice for doing what you say you're doing. Okay.
The biggest thing, folks, to keep in mind is that when you're going through an assessment, the one thing that will kill you is if there is not, and I'm going to use the terminology marriage, there's not a marriage between what your policies, your procedures are saying that you do and what you can actually show through objective evidence. So, you know, for instance, if your organization does drug testing only, okay, you know, can you produce those records? Okay, yes, you have the marriage. It won't necessarily meet the requirements of access to CUI because a drug test isn't going to tell you if they're a U.S. citizen, or it doesn't have the OIG background checks in there. So if you're looking at, you know, folks accessing CUI, understand what you have to look for in their background, what kind of assertions you need to have on file before giving them access to CUI.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I did see in the question before we jump to how you organize this, somebody asked, well, what if you're a one-man show? Your organization is one person, right? Your SSP still needs to state and address every practice. It's just pertains to you. You can put in there, I will do this, I will do that. I don't care how you write it, but it still has to address every practice. Okay.
And to piggyback on that really quickly too, and what Thomas said as well, is that you've got to always think with every control, something needs to be examined, there's going to be an interview of some kind, and there's going to be a test. You've got to be able to check off all three of those. Like Thomas was saying, that marriage between everything has to be able to, what am I looking at that you're saying you're doing? Who am I talking to who can confirm that, yeah, oh no, I absolutely know that these things are going on. I can tell you how they're happening. And then also, how can I test it? What do I see? Like these background check records. Okay, great. I understand that you actually are saying you're doing this. I've talked to people who said they've gone through it. And also I can see that you're doing it. Absolutely. If you cannot have the marriage of those, you are not going to get through an assessment.
Yep. And the other piece is, notice none of us have pointed out how often do you do it, right? We're not going to address that unless you address it in your SSP or your policy. If you tell me in your policy that if there's certain things, if they move positions, they transition into a higher role, we do another background check, then I'm going to ask you for that. But if you don't list that and tell me that, I'm going to say that I will probably mention it's good practice that you do that, right? And then you can put it in your policy or procedures later, but I'm not going to gig you on that, right? Because you showed me what you're doing and you told me what you're doing. Okay.
You mentioned this earlier, Rob, just really quick before we move on, and it's something I think is really important. You mentioned this in one of our conversations. Don't tell the assessors more than what you're willing to prove, more than you're willing to talk about. Only remember, scoping is imperative, not only for your, for your network, but also for the information that you share. You want to scope it down to these are the things I know I can actually prove. These are the things I want to be checked off on. Don't add fluff information because you're going to get asked to test and interview on that as well.
Yeah, just keep it to whatever the question, listen to the question that the assessor is asking and just answer it. It's that simple, right? Okay. So now let's talk about, as you're building this SSP, how can you kind of keep it organized? So that's what we're going to move into next, Orly. One of the best ways is using a responsibility matrix. Okay, so here's a freebie for all of you guys that are looking for something free out there. This responsibility matrix is Redspin's responsibility matrix with a lot of the stuff taken out. Dr. Thomas Graham built this matrix from scratch, and it assisted us in more ways than one through the DIBCAC inspection, right? So basically what you want to capture is what the practice is and a description of the practice. That's a simple copy and paste, right? Then you want to identify who the primary person is for that particular practice, and taking ACL 1 3.1.1, who is the primary person that's going to take care of that policy, those procedures, etc. Who's addressing it? And then who's the alternate? Because it may be Thomas is the primary, but what if Thomas wins the lottery, as he mentioned, and goes to Bora Bora? Well, you need an alternate, right? So somebody's got to pick that up and make sure that it's staying up to date. The other thing you want to do is kind of identify what their roles are, because that should be captured somewhere in an SSP or policies or whatever. Who's all responsible, what their roles are, and then kind of where those artifacts reside. Where is the location that you're going to send the assessor to find those? Okay. And then I'll shut up and let Thomas jump in since this is his.
Well, no, I've been looking through, the questions as folks have been asking, and, several folks have asked about a matrix, and, some folks have asked who needs to be in the interviews. Well, what we were talking about in this portion of the webinar is how do I construct that SSP? How can I, what's going to make my life easier? This is it, folks. This is the blueprint for everything that's going to go on really during the assessment. When we started constructing ours, this was the first thing that we planned out. We took each of the practices, put them in there, put the description, and then we stepped through, okay, whose responsibility is it? What's their role? Are they the Director of Information Services? Are they VP of Marketing? Who's their backup? Because yes, you have to have a backup unless you're a shop of one. And if you're a shop of one, then you are your own backup and you're the busiest man in the company or woman. But what procedures, what documentation supports this particular practice? Where are they located? What other type of artifacts, can you use to support it, whether it be enclave firewall rules, O365 roles, and so on and so forth, and where are those located? You now have 90% of the information that you'll need to put in that SSP, because you've identified responsibilities, you've identified inherited documentation, and you've identified, really where the technical aspects of it are going to be.
The test.
Yep. So this is your cheat sheet. If you are really looking for a cheat sheet, here it is.
And this is great when you have an audit. You have an assessor assessment, right? You have an assessor come in, you can hand them this. Here you go. Here's where all of our stuff is located. Here's the answers to all of your questions. You're going to have a significantly easier time giving them something where they can work through it themselves and find that documentation, those different locations of items to examine. It's going to be so much easier doing that.
Yeah. The other thing I want to go ahead, Thomas.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, some of the other questions that, you know, folks have asked is, what about the interviews? What about your external service providers, MSPs, you know, CSPs, whatever? Primary responsibility for this still, you know, there should be somebody within your organization that is responsible for ensuring the MSP or the CSP or whatever it is holding to what they need to do. So if you have a document like this, these are the folks that the assessors are going to want to interview. They're going to want to interview the primary, and they're going to want to interview the alternate. And if you have certain, you know, aspects, like if you're using cloud infrastructure, we use cloud infrastructure, you still have to ensure that third party is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Keep in mind, you know, the prevailing notion is that, well, you know, reciprocity with any of those is federate, moderate, or equivalent. The equivalency hasn't technically been defined yet. So when you're looking at the different aspects and when you're getting into terminology, understand that there's a difference between, and I'm going to use this as an example, FIPS 140 TAC 2 compliant and FIPS 140 TAC 2 certified. And when you're going through and you have your interviews set up, those folks that are going to be responsible for this within your own organization need to understand how that, you know, not the granular details, but you need to understand how that third party organization is addressing it. And if they don't understand how they're addressing it, then, you know, that's a whole separate webinar that we can have on that. But understand, this is the blueprint. Mm-hmm. You know, folks have asked for, you know, what can you know, what's out there free, what's low cost, you know, what can get me to it.
Yeah.
Here it is.
Here it is.
Now, all right, gentlemen, I'm just cognizant of the time. Why don't we go on to takeaways, and then we can take a few questions, because there are a lot of them that are piling up.
Right. So Orly, before we go back one more. Here's a key takeaway. See the column G, procedure titles, right? We've kind of told the assessors, this is the documents that we're going to show you and test to. Notice if you look at 800-171 alpha, for that particular practice, it says the assessor can choose from, and it's got a whole list of all these different things they can look at. Notice that Thomas has said, this is what we're going to give you to look at, and this will suffice to meet this practice. Okay, I just wanted to point that out as a takeaway. Okay, so let's move on because we want to get some question and answers. So here's some key takeaways for everybody out there. First one is the basic one, follow NIST 800-171. Does your SSP, I think somebody asked the question, does it need to contain, you know, the things listed in 800-171 alpha? No, 800-171 alpha is for the assessor and how to do the assessment. That's really what it's for. Things the assessor should look at during the assessment, okay? So it doesn't have to be in the SSP, but you do have to address in the SSP each practice from 171, all right? Examine artifacts. We can choose from, I've already pointed this out. That doesn't mean we're going to look at every one of those. We only need to go as far as necessary to determine you are doing what you said you're doing. That's it. I don't have to look at any others. I know I've seen LinkedIn. Everybody says there's 360 objectives you need to match and you need to do. That is not the case. I'm telling you right now, that is not the case. Show me in the documentation where it says that, because in NIST 800-171, it says choose from. And as an assessor, I'm going to choose from until I determine, yes, you are meeting that practice, okay? Other thing is don't overthink it. Keep it simple. Remember, we've talked about remember who your audience is and who's going to be looking at this, right? Mainly it's the employees and the assessors and auditors, okay? Keep everything short, concise, to the point. And it's okay to utilize templates, but as Thomas and Noel and Orly and I were talking earlier, for anybody that's ever built a router, right? And you go through and you do everything to build the router and you go to enable it and there's a mistake. What is easier, starting over or going through all that stuff to find where the mistake is? That's up to you, okay? The main thing and last thing for you is don't be afraid to ask for help. there's all kinds of folks out there that can assist you, but you got to be careful who you go to for that assistance. All right. The C3PAOs are authorized. They are full of provisional assessors that know what they're looking for, have been through an audit and with DIBCAC and can assist you. Organizations such as PreVeil, there's others out there, but PreVeil is predominant in CMMC with all of their webinars that talks about everything CMMC. It would only make sense to reach out to PreVeil and say, hey, what kind of templates do you got, right? What kind of policy packages can I get from you? How tailored are these? Can you assist me in prepping those? Because yes, PreVeil can assist you and so can the C3PAOs. RPOs are out there, all right? You can, I highly recommend you go out to the marketplace on CMMC's website and find one of those organizations there. Don't just take somebody's word that they're an RPO and they're showing a badge. You need to go in and validate it and verify. I'll shut up now.
So we're going to take a few minutes for the Q&A. I mean, there's about 30 questions out there that we could answer from. While we're doing that, this is just how you get in touch with everyone. These are their emails. So there are a lot of questions out there, but I'm going to start with the list of questions that were sent in. And I'll ask it, and I'll just ask you guys to, you know, Noel, Robert, and Thomas, if one of you feels like you can take this on, just raise your hand. So when should there be more than one SSP?
Oh gosh, I hope not.
I mean, well, I mean,
One's
one's is enough. I mean, I suppose you could have a larger, and Thomas, you told me anything too, but a larger CSP that covers your whole organization. And then if you did, you know, separate out an enclave for CUI, you could have sort of like a diminished version. But I don't think there's ever a reason, I hope there's never a reason to have two of them that are full scale.
Well, you could have two CUIs or I'm sorry, two SSPs, and the reason being, and this is the example I'm thinking in my head, you have two geographically separated buildings and everything is on-prem and the systems don't talk directly to each other.
That's a good point.
Then you would have to have SSPs for both locations. In that situation, I would suggest having an overarching SSP for items that cover both. And then you can have a local SSP that for any items that's handled by the overarching, you just point to it. And anything that is specific, and when I'm thinking specific, I'm thinking maybe physical security specifics. Then you can include that in the individualized SSPs. But that's the best example I can think of.
Yeah, I can't think of another one either.
I would avoid that as much as possible and try and get everything in one. That's just me. But
Absolutely.
Or Lee, let me address another one because everybody's asking for, hey, provide me some free templates. Where are they? Google it. That's the only thing I can tell you. You can find templates out. They're all out there. Do I have any free templates for you? I do not. You can Google it. And again, you can build it from scratch. You can take somebody's stuff and reorganize it. But as far as I'm aware, free means Google. Specific, reliable means contact PreVeil or another similar organization. Okay, so we addressed that one.
Well, yeah, I just saw in the questions that people sent in, that was also a concern. Let me get the next one here. Should an SSP detail determination statements or just the control statements?
That is a great question. I would try to keep it limited to what the practice is asking. Again, as Noel mentioned earlier, don't try to give too much information. Just listen to the question and answer it. That's exactly what Thomas did. Our SSP addresses the actual question of the practice. And then if there's detail that so the SSP, when Thomas created it, again, using ACL1 3.1.1, right? As an example, I can read the SSP and see everything Thomas is doing for Redspin. Perfect. If I want details, I'm going to go check that policy, right? But do I need to check the policy? If he gave me enough detail in there, I can actually just go to the test phase, right? So just try to keep it to the practice. Address each practice and you should be fine.
All right, here's an interesting one. Noel, I'd like to hear from you, and then maybe Robert and Thomas, you can jump in with your experience. So where can I obtain a checklist of all of the artifacts needed to pass a C3P AO audit?
I think that's another one of those examples, just like the templates. You can Google and find a whole bunch of different checklists and information, but again, it's much like much like the other documentation we've talked about. You want to go to somebody you trust, like a PreVeil or a Redspin or an RPO that you can find, on the marketplace. That's where you want to be having those conversations. I would not just bank on a checklist of artifacts that you find unless it's from a trusted source like SANS or NIST. But I'll let Thomas and Rob chime in on that.
Well, honestly, your checklist is listed in NIST 800-171. Just look at what the inspector has a choice to choose from. That's your list, right? Again, Thomas kind of organized via the responsibility matrix of what the DIBCAC would look at for us, right? And then if they had anything further beyond what Thomas said, and just Thomas pointed out in one of our other podcasts, when he did this, he made sure he grabbed at least 3 of those things in the choose from list, right? At least 3. That way, if the first one, if the DIBCAC inspector was like, yeah, okay, let me see another one. He had another one to go to. And oh, by the way, he had a third one to go to. All were listed there, and he controlled the flow of the assessment by what he gave them, right?
All right, Thomas, let me ask you one. Is a new OSCAL format for SSP creation an acceptable evidence type? And why don't you tell people what this question is asking? What is an OSCAL format?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with the OSCAL format. Without knowing the specific reference from that, Orly, what I can say is the biggest things that you need to have in an SSP from a format standpoint is one is the practice implemented? Is it not implemented, or is it not applicable? And if it's not applicable, you can't just mark not applicable. You have to define why it is not applicable to your implementation. The other thing, there should be some type of scoping that kind of defines what the SSP covers. You can have terminology on there if there's terminology that's specific to your organization, or you want to ensure the specific definition of something is listed. Then yes, you can have a definition section in there. But the biggest thing is, look, guys, when you're putting together an SSP, what you are trying to tell is your story. Your story on how you are protecting that CUI data, whether it be in a cloud infrastructure, whether it be a server, whether it be on a laptop sitting behind Rob, there in that conference room. How are you protecting it? Here is how we as an organization are doing this to make sure it's meeting the requirements that the DoD set forth. And yes, there's tons of templates out there, and I apologize, I don't know all of them because more seem to come up, every day. But to Rob's earlier point, you can go it alone, or either us at Redspin or PreVeil. We've already went through the initial stages for that for you, and have done a lot of the initial legwork. So it could make your lives a lot easier, especially if you're a smaller organization.
Yeah, and if I can help you out, I mean, this is just common sense, Rob, thinking. I look at OSCAL, I have no clue what that is. The only thing I see similar to OSCAL and CMMC is the C in OSCAL, right? So if I'm going to go take a math test in college, I'm not going to study English. I'm going to study the math, right? So I don't know what OSCAL is, but I know what CMMC is, and I know what I'm being certified to and what the assessment is for. So I'm going to use CMMC, and that is NIST 800-171. So just keep it simple, stick to the regulation they've given, and go from there.
All right. We are kind of running over time, so I'll just kind of round this out with one more question to each of you, given that we have so many questions. I feel obliged to try and get a few more in. Excuse me. All right. First of all, here's one for you, Noel. What other tools do PreVeil clients commonly use to address the CMMC requirements that are beyond the scope of PreVeil?
So the biggest one that we talk about a lot is endpoint management. That's a massive one. And then also training. There's a lot of like the trainings that we discussed here, role-based training for your individuals who are doing administrative functions or managing your SIEM or managing, whatever specific roles they have. Those are the types of things that a lot of different people are using. We mentioned Know before. That's actually one of those biggest security trainings out there. There's also a lot of different solutions like ExoStar and ComplyUp that can help you sort of manage all of the information that you have in your SSPs and policies. There's a lot of different tools out there that can help you sort of manage everything that's sort of outside of the scope of PreVeil. But again, also endpoint management. There's a lot of endpoint management tools out there as well, because you want to make sure that you have, for example, if you have Microsoft Defender is actually really great for endpoint management and endpoint vulnerabilities. There's a lot of different ones out there. We would be here all day if I listed all of them, but those are just kind of the high level ones.
All right. So here's going to be one last question for Robert and Thomas, and then we'll wish everyone good afternoon. So it says if an OSC leverages an MSP or MSSP, does the system security plan have to reference practices implemented by the MSP, such as configuring the OSC's firewall, implementing BitLocker, or reviewing logs?
So the short answer is yes. Now, the way that we did that is we actually requested the documentation package from the folks that we worked with, and we incorporated that into our objective evidence. And within our own SSP, what we identified is whether this was the responsibility of us or this was the responsibility of someone else. And if it was the responsibility of someone else, we were able to show that we had done our due diligence, we had gotten the documentation, and we pointed to it in our SSP. Think back to the responsibility matrix that we were just talking about a few moments ago. That would be one of the items that would be listed in there for physical security, because let's say you're using a cloud provider, more than likely you're not going to be the one that is coordinating the physical security parameters of the data center wherever their servers are located. So how else are you going to know whether or not they are meeting the requirements and can show that to the assessor?
And the other thing is, Thomas mentioned earlier, marrying the documents, right? So we go up and within our documentation to a certain point where it hands off, and then the MSP picks up. So we just need to make sure our point connects there, and then theirs takes from there and moves on.
This makes me think, if they're getting married, what are their children going to look like? I don't know. That's a scary thought.
A very long document.
All right. And on that unfortunate note and attempt at humor, I'm going to have to say goodbye and thank you to our guest, Robert and Thomas. As a pleasure as always. And to my colleague, Noel, thank you once again for joining me in this torturous hour. It's been great.